Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. I'm Gene Barr. I'm your host for this week's show. Today we have Auditor General Tim DeFoor, who watches over your taxpayer dollars. And in this season of potholes, we're going to talk about Pennsylvania's roads and highways, and we're going to start that right after this.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. My first guest today is Auditor General Tim DeFoor, who is with us here in the studio. Auditor General, thanks for being with us here today.
Gene, thanks for having me back.
Yes, you've been on here before, so thank you. So you were just reelected to your second term as Auditor General. And I know that you've got a couple of firsts. You're the first person of color to be elected to a statewide row office. And I believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, you are the first person who's actually an auditor who's been the Auditor General.
That's the part that I can't believe. I'm glad that the people of this Commonwealth recognized my experience and felt that I was the right person to be Auditor General, someone who's an actual auditor.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, I know you were first elected in 2020 at a time when the Republican did not carry the top of the ticket, but you and Treasurer Stacey Garrity did. What do you attribute that to?
Working hard. I mean, I had a very simple message when I campaigned in 2020 and this past campaign, and that was to do the work the way it was supposed to be done. I mean, work that I've been doing for my entire career, and that's watching over Pennsylvania taxpayer dollars. And that message was very simple. Didn't have any political connotations to it. It's simply just doing the job the way it was supposed to be done.
Now, in a job with numbers, and I've heard you say this before, you and I have talked about this, you talked about the fact that when you were in school, you hated math.
I hated math.
Which is really seems like it butts up against each other.
Yeah. So, and I did. So I suffered from math anxiety, actually. And it was a college professor that taught me not to be afraid of numbers by teaching a class, not using a chalkboard or a textbook, but by using dice and a deck of cards.
Okay.
And by showing that numbers represented something, and they weren't this big bad thing out to get me. And once I recognized that numbers meant something, everything that I had learned about math prior to that, I forgot.
Okay.
And I learned a new way to learn about math. And even though, of course, I love accounting, but because of that, my first love with regards to math is actually statistics.
Okay.
Because of that professor.
So you learned the practicality. Yeah. So I know we had said that you were an auditor, and part of your job you worked in state government and other places and looking at fraud, waste, and abuse. We hear a lot about fraud, waste, and abuse in government. How much did you find? How big of a problem did you find it to be?
So my auditing career actually and investigative law enforcement career actually began with the State Inspector General's office, then with the Attorney General's office. I was also a fraud investigator and an auditor for the federal government. There's a lot of it.
Okay.
I mean, right now, as me and you were talking, there's somebody that's out there trying to figure out a way to get into the government's bank accounts because they realize that government has this big pot of money.
And the COVID dollars probably made it worse.
Exactly. And they're constantly thinking of ways of creating methodologies or creating something to get at that money when they aren't actually entitled to it. So one of the things that I discovered, especially with my background being healthcare, is that there has been and there's still a lot of fraud out there. When you look at the CARES funds that are out there, when you look at the ARP funds that are out there, and you look at the amount of fraud that's out there, it's rampant. It's rampant.
And of course, I guess the electronic version of our world now probably makes it a little bit easier for people to do that, and people get scammed into giving up their information, right?
Actually, it does, and that's unfortunate because when we're talking about scams, the most vulnerable population, our senior citizens, are the ones that are always hurt. That's why I'm so glad that there's organizations that are out there, like AARP, who have what they call scam jams. And I've actually participated in one a few years ago where we teach senior citizens, not only senior citizens, but their families about what to look out for and what potentially can be fraud.
Well, that makes sense. So we're going to cut for a break. When we come back, we're going to continue talking with Auditor General Tim DeFoor.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. We're back here with Auditor General Tim DeFoor. General, one of the things that I know that you've been talking about a lot recently has been the need for increased financial literacy, working that through schools, which makes the most sense. Look, we see adults that don't have it, and I know in my experience in my career, I saw the results of a lack of that. So what brought you to make that a significant endeavor and activity of the Auditor General's office?
Well, first of all, let me start off by saying it's my belief that financial literacy needs to be taught in every school in Pennsylvania from kindergarten through 12th grade.
Okay.
And here's how I first got involved with it. I was just elected Dauphin County Controller, and I'm going to go back maybe about 10 years ago. And I was asked to speak to some college students about government finance and what I did as controller. I left some time at the end for questions and answers. None of the questions were about what I did or about me. All the questions were about students' own personal finance. And so I started researching about where schools in Pennsylvania are actually teaching it. And I saw that a lot of them weren't. So fast forward, I'm elected Auditor General. So in 2021, we started our Be Money Smart Financial Literacy Initiative. And what that is bringing awareness to financial literacy. Going to schools in Pennsylvania, to high schools in particular, where some schools have been teaching it for well over a decade. Going to local organizations, working with some of our financial institutions, bringing awareness to financial literacy, talking about the importance of financial literacy.
Let's talk a little bit about, just so people understand, financial literacy means, I assume, understanding interest rates, knowing how to, I guess in the old days, balance a checkbook,
right,
but make sure you've got enough money in the account before you spend those dollars. Is that what we're talking about here?
The basics.
Okay. Saving for retirement.
Saving for retirement, understanding credit, understanding taxes, what you pay in taxes, saving for emergencies, just the basics, personal finance.
Okay. How has that been received so far, that pitch for financial literacy among the legislature?
It's been very well received. As a matter of fact, I believe in school year 25, 27, or maybe even this year, Pennsylvania is passed a law that high school seniors are going to have to take a half a credit of financial literacy in order to graduate.
Okay.
And I think that's fantastic. It's a good start.
Good start.
But as I said earlier, I mean, it's something that should be taught in every school in Pennsylvania from kindergarten through 12th grade.
Good. So, I want to talk a little bit before we leave here. A couple of your more recent audits. One of them is an audit of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and another is a recent one you announced, I believe, last week on cyber charter schools. Let's talk about DCNR first. What did you find? What were any concerns you had in that?
Is that when awarding grants, they had processes that were in place. They weren't following those processes. And
who are these grants to?
These grants were to local organizations who had conservation projects in their communities. And again, it's a great program, but if you have processes that for others to follow in awarding grants, follow those processes, because if you don't follow your own internal processes, that's going to lead to a lot of other problems. And we've identified some of the problems in that audit report.
Good. And now we have basically a minute and a half left. The cyber charter, there's been a huge growth in cyber charters, understandably, because of the desire among many people for school choice, and these have arisen. You brought up some concerns that your office found with what you see in cyber charter, which is a tremendous, as I mentioned, a tremendous growth area. What did you find there?
We have an old formula for cyber charter schools that's 23 years old.
For how they receive state dollars.
How they receive state dollars, and it needs to be fixed.
Okay.
I mean, And even prior to that, we had another audit with regards to school. We had another audit prior to that with regards to school reserves, public school reserves.
Got it. Okay.
And we found some flaws with regards to that.
Okay.
So we feel that, and the audits showed that you have some issues that need to be addressed with regards to how our schools are funded.
Okay, good. So, and obviously, we'll see how that goes. I know that's continued looked at, particularly with the spending dollars proposed in this year's budget that the governor has proposed. So, any other priorities you have for your second term here?
No, continue the work that we've been doing. I mean, for the first term was about transforming the office, how we do our work, being more efficient with regards to the work that we do. Again, going back to the basics of what the department is about, and growing on that. Just doing the work the way it's supposed to be done, following the Pennsylvania Fiscal Code and the auditing standards that we're supposed to follow.
And very quickly, you're term limited. What's next for Tim DeFoor?
Don't know.
Don't know.
Don't know. So I'm into year number 1 of this first term, I just haven't had a chance to think about it.
Understand. Hey, thank you for being on with us today. We look forward to having you back in the future. When we return, we're going to talk about roads, bridges, and highways and the state of them in Pennsylvania. So please return with us.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by
Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Our guest for this segment is Bob Latham. Bob is Executive Vice President of the Associated Pennsylvania Constructors. Bob, welcome to the show.
Gene, good to be with you again.
Who are the Associated Pennsylvania Constructors?
Well, they're the men and women of Pennsylvania that basically build our roads and bridges, do major roadway work. About 30,000 people involved in engineering, construction, design, maintenance of our roads and bridges. Pennsylvania, of course, has PennDOT, I guess I should say, has 40,000 miles of roadway that it needs to maintain. That's more than New York, New England, and combined. So we have a vast state network and then a vast county and local road network, too, that needs to be maintained.
How much do we spend in the Commonwealth on total annually on roads, bridges, highways?
Well, PennDOT's budget is somewhere around the $5 to $6 million range, but you have to understand that that's their $1 billion range. Thank you. But that includes all the maintenance work that they do. Just think about all the snow that has to be plowed. We've spent a lot of money keeping I-90 clear in Erie this year. The capital, what we call the construction budget, is somewhere in the neighborhood of about just under $3 billion a year in roadway work, contract work that gets done.
And I made a comment at the start of the show about being in pothole season, and you talked about the challenges. I understand, not your fault, because we're going to talk about that just for a second. The challenges, that is the extensive roadway system Pennsylvania has, but when people see that, and this is a time of the year when it starts, Pennsylvania also has I wouldn't say unique, but a different problem with that because of freeze-thaw, right?
That's correct. Former PennDOT Secretary Brad Mallory used to say we have a situation in Pennsylvania where old, cold, and wet. And so the freeze-thaw, and that plays havoc with concrete and asphalt, requires a lot of resurfacing to be done, bridge work to be done. We've had some success over the last several years in terms of reducing that number of what we call bad bridges or structurally deficient bridges. So we've done very well with that. When you and I worked on what we called Act 89 years ago, I think we had some 6,000 bad bridges. We're down to around 3 now, so we've really cut into that.
That is an improvement.
Governor Shapiro rightly points out that we've even done more during his administration, so we're on the right track.
So where do
But there's always a but to the end of that.
I understand, which gets into the next thing. With all these billions that are necessary, where does that money come from? How do we fund those billions of dollars that go into our roads, bridges, and highways?
Well, people who drive on our roads and bridges pay for it.
So basically a user fee.
It is basically a user fee. When we passed that last major transportation bill, we made the policy decision, or our policymakers did, that it would be mostly driven through the fuel tax, a tax on motor fuels, which we call the oil company franchise tax. And the registration fees and license fees in Pennsylvania are much lower than they are in other states. And that really was a public policy that said if you, it was a low cost to access the system, but the more you drove, the more you paid, which is why we have a relatively high gas tax. That's what we use to pay for road and bridge maintenance and construction.
Yeah, so somebody comes into the station, they put the nozzle in the tank. Basically, some of that money, as we know, goes to pay that.
That's correct.
With the proliferation of alternatively fueled vehicles, how is that being captured, or is it?
Well, for many, many years, we were attempting to have a commensurate registration fee for all electric vehicles. That finally passed last session, so we now have somewhat parity, I guess, if you will. If you own an electric vehicle, a Tesla, electric Ford, or whatever, that does not, of course, you're not using any gas, you will pay instead of like a $70 registration fee that I pay on my gas-powered car, your electric vehicle owner will now start to pay $250 a year. And that's about what I pay in gas taxes.
Good. When we come back, we're going to continue talking with Bob Latham, talk a little bit about the condition of Pennsylvania's roads, bridges, and highway system. Back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania American Water. We keep life flowing across the Keystone State.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. We're here with Bob Latham, who's Executive Vice President of the Pennsylvania Associated PA Constructors. Make sure I get that right. So we're talking about how we fund our roads, bridges, highways, some of the other issues. And I know one of the issues that your organization has worked on for years has been the fact that this motor license fund, where the dollars come out of when they go in from drivers and license fees, et cetera, has also funded state police functions. And as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, that was up to close to $1 billion a year at one point.
It plateaued at $800 million a year in 2016, and then the General Assembly looked at and implemented a system where we started to step it down. We're now at about $250 million, and I think there's general agreement that number needs to go to zero. Once again,
and nobody's saying we don't fund state police. The dollars are coming from somewhere else.
I was just going to point out that Governor Shapiro, in his first year in office, set up a special fund in the general fund for the state police to make sure that exactly what you just said doesn't happen, that we fully fund the state police. As a matter of fact, I think there's greater numbers of cadets coming in, and it's all worked out very well. So we're seeing a step down of that. We'd like to see that go down to zero here eventually, so that motorists who are paying their gas tax registration fees see that commensurate with road improvements and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so also want to talk briefly before we move on to some of the other things in the future. Your organization worked in past years on a couple of work zone safety issues, that is having unmanned vehicles on the roads and also work zone cameras for safety. I know you supported that. How has that worked out?
It's worked out very well. We're seeing motorists slow down in those work zones. We did some tweaking of that legislation last year, which requires more signage, which was correct, and we're doing a better job with that. So motorists will know, you'll know when you're coming upon a speed camera in a work zone. And it's a very simple way to avoid the fine, slow down. And we are seeing people do that.
And there's some tolerance there, I know, too. But,
but we are seeing people slow down in work zones, which is important because, people working out there deserve to come home, deserve to have a safe environment in which to work and not be injured on the job. But also, it's for safety of motorists themselves. Work zones are not real, there's compressed lanes, it's hard to get through, and you really do need to slow down the work
Yes,
zone.
exactly. Have you seen a reduction in
Definitely
injuries?
seen a reduction in injuries as a result of that.
So where do we move Where's your organization want to move forward? What are you guys working on going forward?
So today, as we look at the budget situation, going back to sort of that total transportation, public transit, of course, has a funding problem. Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Administration, SEPTA, and other transit agencies throughout the state. So the governor's made a proposal there. We're looking at a situation with PennDOT now where we've made a lot of progress, but if we absent some additional capital infusion, we will not see that progress continue. The inventory of bad bridges will continue to go up. We're seeing some stress on our local, more rural roads that PennDOT maintains. And while we have this large capital investment every year, we're seeing right now a confluence of very big major interstate projects which are kind of sucking up the available money. So we're going to need to look at some approaches where we can get some more cash, more capital investment into those rural roads, and then also fixing bridges so that we can continue with that progress. So that's the kind of thing we're working on. And we work in concert with the transit folks for a total transportation approach. That's what we've always done in Pennsylvania.
I want to talk about that too before we talk about some of the other options quickly, because we're getting a little short on time.
Sure.
How do we fund mass transit in Pennsylvania now? I guess some comes from the PA Turnpike Commission, correct?
Well, the PA, we had a system where they would float bonds that went to a public transit fund. Essentially, there's a large portion of money for transit, and I point out that there are public transit facilities in all 67 counties. Shared ride is very important in rural counties, so it's not just a Philadelphia or a Pittsburgh situation. So counties around those major areas do kick in money. There's fares that people pay, but basically it's a general fund, a state general fund allotment. And so now they're looking for an increase in that allotment. That's going to be part and parcel of the budget discussions. But I think throwing in the mix for potential increase in funding for roads and bridges will help move that multimodal approach forward.
Very quickly, in just about 15, 20 seconds, as you move forward looking at other options. I know a few years ago there was a study commission put together to look at various things. Are you guys still looking at things like vehicle miles traveled, just is that still an option on the table?
I think when you drive the Pennsylvania Turnpike now, you see these gantries coming up, and into the future, that's a potential for a funding source that could be expanded to other roads.
Good. All right. Great. Bob, thanks for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
Thanks to my guests for being on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Please tune in again next week. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you.